Hi, I'm Dan Moon. I'm the administrative horticulturist slash manager at Citywide Nursery here in the Bronx. Citywide Nursery is a 5-acre nursery that raises perennials and shrubs for the 5 boroughs. We grow native and non-native plants that are freely available to gardeners and community groups throughout the city. So in any given year, we raise about 40,000 plants and distribute about that same number to projects all over the place. So if you're a community group or a volunteer group that wants to enrich your park or the green streets or tree beds, you can access plants here for free. We're a resource for plants and also for horticultural information for the Parks Department and affiliated groups. A little bit about myself. I've been working for the Parks Department for 6 years. I started out in organic farming in the Hudson Valley in Texas, and then in 2014 I started as a gardener in Brooklyn and worked there for 4 years, and then in 2018 I started working here at Citywide Nursery as administrative horticulturist. So a Parks Department gardener is a staff in maintenance and operations that maintains and plants gardens throughout the boroughs. So some parks have gardens or horticultural areas that may be greeting gardens or part of the landscape in a park. And there's also gardens in green streets, so in the malls and the medians, and also in like triangles and intersections. Sometimes some of those are parks properties, and gardeners maintain the shrubs and perennials in those sites. They serve an ornamental or horticultural function, but they also gardens and hort sites also serve as important biodiversity sites for native and non-native animals, insects, pollinators, birds, all kinds of wildlife find refuge in horticulture sites, as well as the trees. Gardeners play a very important role in keeping the city beautiful and green and hospitable to native wildlife. So when you're thinking about planning your garden and considering what types of plants you want to put in it, you have to kind of go through a checklist in your mind or on paper and consider what you want to grow. So the questions that you want to ask is, first, yes, what do you want to grow? Do you want to grow plants for culinary purposes? Do you want to grow them for ornamental purposes? Do you want to grow them for market or for personal use or for family use? So there's a bunch of questions that will guide your decision in which type of plants you want to plant. The second thing you want to consider are your site conditions. So that would include light levels. Do you get how much exposure to the sun you get? Is it a shady site? Is it a sunny site? The soil type that you have, if you're growing in the ground or if you're growing in raised beds. How well does the soil drain? Is it a really dry site? Do you have access to water? Which is the next thing. So do you have an ability to use water from either a fire hydrant or from a hose? Do you also get a lot of wind exposure? If you have a windy site, you might want to choose plants that are hardier, or you might want to make it so that the wind is dampened by a windbreak. Also, the last thing that you want to consider, or one of the last things to consider, is the time of the season that you're looking to start your seeds or to plant your plants out. So if you're starting in the summer, in the middle of the summer, you can grow a wide variety of plants, as opposed to if you're starting in the middle of the winter. The days to maturity is a factor that's dependent on each individual crop and even sometimes the particular variety. So, for example, one variety of tomato may be 80 days to maturity and one might be 70. That can make a difference if you're looking at when you look at the time of the year that you're planting in your zone. You want to make sure that whatever you plant, the timing works out so that you don't plant something that's going to run into a frost. Say if you are looking at growing a 70-day tomato, you're not going to want to plant it in September when your frost is going to be around October 15th. That's only about 45 days. You're not going to get crops if you plant into a frost. Likewise, you don't want to plant something that likes cool temperatures in the hot season. Like, for example, you don't necessarily want to plant a lettuce in August because it will bolt and you won't get nice, tasty lettuce leaves. Another thing to consider once you figure out your varieties and plants and timing, and that matches the site conditions, is how much do you want to grow? Do you want to grow 100 pepper plants, or do you want to grow 10 pepper plants? You want to make sure that what you harvest is going to meet your needs as far as the quantities and, how much salad can you really eat, or how much kale can you eat. You don't want to grow too much of it so that it goes to waste when you can grow something else that you really want. So you can also look at there are a lot of resources online that you can find about garden planning. Cornell has good documents for home gardeners and community gardeners to plan gardens. So you can also find the Green Thumb Growing Food Toolkit on the Green Thumb website, and that's a great guide for garden planning. The one other consideration when you're growing plants or planting a garden is to think about annuals versus perennials. The difference is annuals are plants that grow for one season and then they flower and die, and you have to plant them each season. So most of your garden vegetables like broccoli, carrots, kale, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, etc. are annuals because they only have one season in the ground. Some of them will last for 2 seasons, but in general they're considered garden annuals, and you have to plant them every year. The other type of plant is called perennials, and perennials means that they grow from year to year. So they'll last multiple years, 3 or more years that a plant will grow in the ground, and over winter we consider perennials. And the nice thing about them is you don't have to replant them every year. They'll come back. So plants like oregano, mint, sage, asparagus, berry plants, and bushes, most fruit plants are perennials, and those are really good plants because, like I said, they're always there from year to year, and you don't have to reseed them every year. The drawback to them is once you put them in a space, you don't usually want to move them, although you can. So you have to choose carefully how many perennials you put into your space, because if you want to also grow annuals, you don't want to necessarily fill it up with perennials. So those are the major considerations for garden planning. So when it comes to vegetables, you have 2 main types of crops as far as the seasonality. You have warm and cool season crops. A warm season crop is a plant that will die when exposed to frost and or freezing temperatures. So some examples of these are peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, okra, corn, green beans, and basil. These are all plants that as soon as the frost comes, their leaves will turn brown and they'll die back, and the plant is just over. So it's very important to consider your the timing of planting of these plants. Usually you want to plant them out in the field or in the garden after the last frost date, which in this zone you can safely say the last frost date is May 1st, I believe, or May 15th to be safe. You start these plants early in the greenhouse or indoors, so that when the last frost date comes, you have a good-sized plant to go into the ground. It's usually easier to do it that way because warm season plants generally have a higher temperature of germination, which is a factor. So usually if you start it indoors, you have consistent warmer temperatures, whereas if you try to put the seed in the ground after the last frost date, you'll still have cooler temperatures in the 60s and 50s that you won't have as good germination. So it's really advantageous to start these warm season plants indoors. Cool season plants are plants that can take a light frost up to even a full freeze. Those are all considered cool season plants. So lettuce, spinach especially can take a very hard freeze. Kale, collard greens, cabbage, anything in the Brassicaceae family, which is the cabbage and broccoli family, do well in the cold. And you start these plants earlier indoors if you want to have if you want to have them growing in throughout the spring during the cool season. You can start them indoors, and you can also start them towards the end of summer to plant in the fall, or the early fall, say in August or September, so that you can be harvesting them throughout the fall into the early winter even. So this chart here is a good example of a vegetable season chart, which you can see the optimal time of the year to grow the plants. And this one includes a start indoors color, so you have from orange to this color here when you start indoors, transplant, and harvest. So just kale is interesting because it likes cooler weather, so you can start it and grow it throughout this season. Actually, you can harvest it longer, but there's a spring and fall crop with kale. Same thing with lettuce, also likes cool weather. You can do 2 crops of lettuce. You don't want to grow it in the heat of summer during June through August, because the plants do not like that and they'll have a harder time. Although I find you can kind of grow kale throughout the summer. But onions also are an early crop. Brussels sprouts usually take a very long time to grow, so you want to plant them earlier in the season because a lot of Brussels sprouts are 80 to 90 days, and they'll actually last a bit longer into the fall. But just if you are searching the web for a chart like this, make sure that it matches the growing zone that you're in. And I would go with a reputable website like Green Thumb or Cornell Cooperative Extension, because they're more geared towards your growing zone, and they're going to probably be a better guide. And if you're not from New York, find your own local state or land-grant university that has the chart for your zone. Some cool season plants will even be able to overwinter, meaning that they can be outside in the garden bed and over the entire duration of the winter, and then in the springtime they will come up again, and you'll maybe be able to get another harvest, or they'll flower, like in the case of kale and beets and Swiss chard. Those crops will live over the winter and then produce flowers and seeds in the next year. So sometimes it's worth it to leave those plants in the ground, the cool season plants. This brings me actually into the temperature requirements and the temperature range of germination, which varies, as I said, between warm and cool season plants. So of all the different of various different species, and the temperature germination requirements of them. So what you have is a minimum temperature, an optimum range, and an optimum temperature, and the maximum temperature. So asparagus, for example, needs a minimum temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit to germinate. Below that, you will not get any plants growing. The optimum range is 60 to 85, but the optimum temperature is 75. And then the maximum hottest temperature that you can germinate asparagus is 95 degrees. Let's look at a cooler season plant like Swiss chard. The minimum temperature for germination is 40 degrees. So right now in November, you can actually germinate some Swiss chard seeds outside, although as seedlings with the winter coming on, you probably wouldn't want to do that because they might die. The optimum temperature range is actually pretty wide, from 50 to 85 degrees, and they say that at 85 you get most maximum germination, and that is the maximum temperature that you want to germinate it at. So with each of these species, you have a curve of a success rate, where at the lowest temperature you have a percentage that's going to germinate, and then it's going to go up until you reach the optimum temperature range, and then once you get past that optimum range, it will drop off. But for every species, that curve looks different. But you want to use a chart like this in your considerations in the greenhouse of what temperature to keep it at, if you can maintain temperature or regulate the temperature. Also, looking at your soil temperature outside, this is very good information to know. This is not written in stone. There can be some variation between what the chart says and what you can actually do. So I encourage you to test the limits of that and see what you can get out of the garden.